Hi everyone. In this video, we'll be discussing some of the context for Equiano's interesting narrative. All right, so one of those primary contexts, of course, is the transatlantic slave trade. And this map illustrates something that a lot of you probably already know. The transatlantic slave trade was often referred to as the triangular trade because of the triangle that you can see on this map, that traders from England would bring things that were manufactured or made in England to the coast of West Africa, which they would then use to trade or barter for enslaved persons. Then they would use those same ships that were previously carrying these manufactured goods to carry humans across the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies, the Caribbean, North America, and then again, they would exchange. They would sell their enslaved people and then load up with the products from the colonies and bring those back to England or to Europe. So this is why this is referred to as the triangular trade, and why the journey that enslaved persons made from Africa to North America was referred to as the Middle Passage. It's in the middle of this triangular route. Now, another reason I want to devote attention to this image is because this is a real moment in which our subject of this class, British literature before 1800, makes a strong connection to where we are right now in Charleston, South Carolina. For most of this class, it's safe to say that British literature before 1800 felt very distant from Charleston, South Carolina. But in the 18th century, we're starting to see how these places and traditions are in fact connected through a broader transatlantic culture of Europeans developing colonies across the Atlantic Ocean, and then linking them even more tightly through the transatlantic slave trade in particular. This map gives us a sense of exactly where enslaved people from the coast of Africa were taken, especially throughout the New World. And even when, in 1807, the United States Congress banned the importation of enslaved persons, effectively putting an end to that very triangular trade we were just talking about, we know that the practice of slavery and the practice of selling and trading slaves continued in the United States. So even though, the transatlantic global slave trade was ended in 1807 in the United States, you still see this huge increase of enslaved persons in 1860 compared to 1790. So what was a transatlantic slave trade becomes a domestic slave trade that only continues within the United States itself. And I want to also note that slavery as an institution has a long history. Greeks and Romans write about slavery. They had people who were enslaved, and yet the practice in 18th century Europe, England, and America looks very different from some of those historical instances of slavery. Certainly the practice of slavery has a very long history. But before the developments of the 15th century, when Portuguese traders first began to develop this practice, this particular practice, which I'll get to in a minute, it was primarily local and domestic, and for various durations. It could be a period of life, it could be a whole life. It kind of resembled indentured servitude, a concept that people are more familiar with. But in the 18th century, slavery becomes something different, something even more nefarious and disturbing. So first of all, it becomes increasingly widespread in the American colonies. It becomes a primary source of labor in the American colonies, in the 18th century in particular. It also becomes race-based. This was not something that was affiliated with slavery before. Slavery was not attached to someone's race. In fact, the 18th century was very integral to developing and advancing the ultimately fictitious notion of race as a concept. The 18th century decides that race is a real thing and that some races deserve to be subjugated to others. That's a crucial logic that people in the 18th century needed to justify this practice of race-based slavery, which was itself itself an innovation. It was something generally new. Another aspect of this newer form of slavery was that it was hereditary. It wasn't just limited to a single person who, once they died or once they ended the end of their term, it was done. No, this form of slavery was transmitted from one person to their children and to their children and to their children in perpetuity. This was also an alteration to former forms of slavery. Slavery in this context was also involuntary. And I'm not saying slavery in the past was always voluntary, but there were cases in which someone would submit to it. Like, again, indentured servitude. You would agree to this servitude based on something that you get out of it or something like that. No more. This was, human trafficking. And that's the final point. Slavery becomes a global human trafficking operation. This is not something that happens just in a single area, but it involves the literal global transmission of people across an ocean to an entirely new place. So all of these aspects are new to slavery in the 18th century, and all of it makes slavery even more appalling and disturbing when you consider how these practices only make slavery crueler than it already was. And I want us to be aware of the ways that slavery was altered in the 18th century to be race-based and even crueler in nature. I think those are really important things to keep in mind. Even so, while all of this was happening, of course, we had many people justifying the slave trade and the enslavement of people based on race. And here's one example. I asked you to read this very short excerpt this week, so I'll just quickly cover the reasons that William Snelgrave gives in 1734. He says, it's evident that abundance of captives taken in war would be inhumanly destroyed, so that at least many lives are saved and great numbers of useful persons kept in being. So he's kind of rationalizing that, we slave traders are saving these African people from being killed in war. So rather than die, they just come with us to serve as enslaved people. Secondly, when they are carried to the plantations, they generally live much better there than they ever did in their own country. For as the planters pay a great price for them, 'tis their interest to take care of them. Okay, another specious piece of logic. They live so well on these plantations, way better than they would in their homelands back on the coast of West Africa. Thirdly, by this means, the English plantations have been so much improved that 'tis almost incredible what great advantages have accrued to the nation, because the enslaved people are fitter to cultivate the lands there than white people, because they're from similar climates. They're more suited to this work. And while it is true that enslaved people brought their particular expertise with them in terms of how to cultivate certain agricultural products, this makes the assumption that because they are more fitted to this land, they should be the ones doing the work and not white people. And then I missed one arrow here. Then, as to the criminals amongst them, they are by this means effectually transported, never to return again. We're doing these homelands back on the coast of West Africa a favor because we're taking away their criminals. Okay, so, disturbing as all of these reasons are, I wanted us to be aware of the kind of discursive environment in which Equiano finds himself. It's his task to contribute a narrative into this climate where people are offering these reasons in favor of the institution of slavery. And Equiano's task is to tell his life story in a way that challenges the very premises that Snelgrave makes in something like this. And Snelgrave, is just one of many people writing in this way. And then finally, I will say one other thing before pausing this video. When we think about the story of American independence, we rarely think about the role that slavery, the institution of slavery, may have had when it comes to the colonies declaring independence from England. We, of course, always think about the institution of slavery in relation to the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. But I present you with two dates to think about. In 1772, a court in England rules that slavery is illegal there. The ruling only applies to England proper, none of its colonies. And yet, that ruling provoked a kind of international sensational uproar, especially in the colonies where slavery was practiced, as being kind of threatening to those colonies and their way of life. And so, a mere 4 years later, the American colonies declare independence. Are these two events linked? Well, I'm not a historian of this particular era in particular, but multiple historians have made this case. And here's one quote from a reading I posted this week. Multiple historians have pointed out that in part because of the Somerset case, this 1772 ruling, slavery joined other issues in helping to gradually drive apart the Patriots and their colonial government. So the historians claim that the fact that England declared slavery illegal did play a role in the interest of these British colonies in declaring independence from England itself. So that's an important context, I think, to keep in mind when we think about our own narratives of American independence and what were some of the factors behind that decision. Okay, I'm going to pause here and we'll pick back up on the next video.